Hello class, we're going to cover chapter 16's slide deck here, and I'll jump into Visual Studio back and forth just to demonstrate what we're talking about here in this PowerPoint presentation. We're covering organizing and documenting your classes. It'll cover more of the organizing and less of the documenting portion. You can add some XML documentations to your classes, and it'll help in Visual Studio when you hover over things to show what your classes do for people that might use your classes later on. It is helpful, but not widely used. At least where I work, it's not widely used at the moment. So a file with two classes coded one after another. So just because you have a file that's within a namespace doesn't mean you can't have multiple classes in it. And by that same token, just because you're in a file doesn't mean that that file is the only file that that class exists in. So if you look in the form, you'll see a partial keyword. So for example, let me jump to Visual Studio. And when you look at this product maintenance form, you see this partial keyword. And all that means is this is not the only file that this product maintenance class exists in. If you go to this initialize components in F12, you'll see that you're in another file, but still the same product maintenance class. So in the same way that we can have multiple files with one class in it, we can also have multiple classes within the same file, as shown here in this slide. So the use case for this, so here's a public class, outer class, and then from that you can have an inner class. So code that uses an inner class. And if anybody is familiar with a linked list, that's one use case to have an outer class and an inner class. So a linked list is a list, and then within the list it has multiple nodes. So the node is an inner class that has a reference to the next node as well as a piece of data. So it's just specific to the linked list, so that's a use case to have the class inside of your other class. So this shows much like a form does. You see the partial keyword, a customer class that's split into two files. I think Microsoft likes to do it with the form class just to split out the initialized components and a lot of that implementation and abstract that away from the people using it, which I think is usually a disadvantage because then people forget that it exists and that it's still important. So for example, I already used the form as an example here, and they just reiterate it here. Partial class form 1, partial class form 1, two different files, the same class. Code that declares a namespace. Remember, namespaces are similar to packages in Java. It just allows us to put multiple classes in the same namespace and have an entire namespace of classes. So if we go to Visual Studio and you look at the top using statements for namespaces, all of the forms are in this System Windows Forms namespace. All of your collections are in the System Collections generic namespace, so it just lumps all of these together in one large namespace, if you will. And it allows us to import multiple classes all at one time. Here's a way to nest namespaces if you want to. Here's a using directive that specifies a namespace that I just showed previously. And here's some XML documentation you can put at the top of your classes. So you can put a summary. So provides static methods for validating data. I believe there is a shortcut to do this in Visual Studio. Let's go to Visual Studio and see. So let's go to our product class, since that's one we created. Let's go to the get display text. That's a bad example. Maybe the product service stub that I created in the last video. Let's go to get products. And if you do 3 forward slashes, it actually makes the summary for you. So I'm going to say stub implementation to get products from the local database. Okay, so if I save it, now if I go back to where I use it, let's see here. Hopefully this works. Here's my product service.getProducts.toList. And it usually shows you the description that I put here, but I'm not seeing it. I don't know if it's because I need to build it. Let's try to build it. Nope, there's still nothing. Okay. Let's do a clean rebuild. Nope. Okay, well, it usually puts some documentation there so when you hover over it, you see what it does. You can have a summary, you can have the parameters, so you can tell it what the parameters do, what it returns, what the return does. Here are the elements, the XML elements, and what they do. So you notice that it's used here. And that's what I was trying to get to show up. So maybe if I start typing, it'll show up. Let's go back. Let me comment this out. Products equals product service dot get products. Yeah, nothing's showing up yet. Yeah, I don't know. Visual Studio might be being dumb. Let's go back to the PowerPoint. And I think that's about it. Okay. Some other important things when organizing your classes, especially in your classes that you're creating yourself. It's usually best to have all of your private and constants at the top, followed by your properties, and then having your constructors, and then public and private methods below is usually the way that you construct your classes. It just makes it easier to read. That so you know, oh, it's a private method, it's probably at the bottom. Oh, it's a public method, it's probably somewhere in the middle. Oh, it's a property, it's at the top somewhere. It makes it easier for me to read when I'm grading, since I'm grading, 20 or 30 projects, that everything is in that order. I'm not going to be a huge stickler on it. I'm not going to take a bunch of points off or anything if they're not, but it does help me. And it is usually a standard where you work, so it's usually just best to make sure your classes are well organized, that there's not a bunch of spaces, that there's not a bunch of code that's commented out like I have here. So typically if I was at work, I would remove these comments, or I put in these comments to show you as an example. But typically you want to just be able to read the code. You can have these XML comments here, but by and large I try to remove comments, and I try to have everything in that order. You can also remove a lot of things you don't need at the top, so they gray out your using statements. If you're not using these namespaces, you can actually remove them. I believe if you Control plus, you can actually remove unnecessary using statements. But also that can get a little hairy, because if you end up using link and you removed it up here, it won't give you any hints like hey, you don't have your link using statement up here. So it's kind of a double-edged sword if you get rid of the using statement and end up needing it later. So I wouldn't remove using statements until maybe you're done or mostly done with your class. Okay, so if you have any other questions about how to organize your classes, how to make your code more clean, be sure to put them in either the Q&A forum in the discussion board or shoot me an email. All right, see you in the next video. Thanks.